I was gone for just 3 days. 3 quiet days away from this place, thinking that nothing could really change while I was gone. But when I pulled my old truck into the driveway and saw the front steps, my heart dropped so hard it felt like it hit my stomach. There were 3 tiny lynx cubs curled up against my door. Their fur was matted and dirty. Their eyes were half closed. I heard the smallest one crying before I even turned off the engine. That thin, desperate cry sliced right through the quiet afternoon air. I didn't move at first. I sat in the truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Lynx don't come to people. They avoid us like death itself. But here they were, 3 of them, pressed into the corner of my porch like they were trying to disappear into the wood. I got out slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel. As soon as I stepped closer, the largest cub tried to stand up. Its front legs wobbled so badly it almost fell sideways. The smallest didn't even lift its head. I could see its ribs moving with each tiny breath. I whispered without thinking, "Hey, hey there, little ones." My voice sounded broken, even to me. I looked around, scanning the yard, the trees, the slope down to the old creek. Nothing. No sign of a mother lynx watching from the shadows. No sign of anyone. I dropped my bag right there on the porch. The cubs flinched at the sound, but didn't run. They didn't have the strength. I could see how dry their noses were. Their fur looked thin in places, showing patches of pale skin underneath. I knelt down slowly, trying not to scare them any more than they already were. The biggest one lifted its head again, blinking at me with those glassy yellow eyes. Its mouth opened, and it let out a hoarse, breathless mewl. I could smell them now. That sickly, sour smell of starvation and fear. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. I reached out my hand, palm up, and held it there. They didn't move. I sat there for what felt like forever, just breathing, trying to think. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know anything about lynx cubs. How old were they? What did they eat? Could I even touch them without making it worse? I pulled my phone out of my pocket and called animal control. It rang and rang. No answer. I tried the local wildlife rehab center. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice shaking. "Hi, my name is Daniel. There are 3 lynx cubs on my porch. They're starving. I don't know what to do. Please call me back as soon as you can." I ended the call and stared at the phone in my hand. The smallest cub let out another weak cry. I looked at it. Its eyes were barely open. Its tiny paws were curled up under its chest like it was trying to keep warm, but failing. I stood up and went inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood. I dropped my keys on the counter and went straight to the fridge. Nothing. Just some leftover chicken, eggs, a half-gallon of milk. Would milk work? I had no idea. I grabbed the milk carton and poured some into a small ceramic bowl. When I stepped back outside, the cubs didn't move. I set the bowl down in front of them. The biggest one sniffed at it, then lapped a few drops. The smallest didn't even lift its head. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost spilled the milk when I picked it up to try and bring it closer to the weakest cub. It didn't react. I touched its fur gently with my finger. It was cold. I sat back on my heels and felt tears sting my eyes. 3 days. I had only been gone 3 days. I looked out at the tree line again, searching for any movement, any sign of a mother lynx. There was nothing. Just the quiet of the late afternoon and the sound of these tiny breaths fighting to keep going. I didn't know what else to do. So I stayed there, on my porch, with my back against the door, watching over them as the sun started to dip behind the trees, wondering what kind of person could leave 3 helpless babies here to die, and why they had chosen my porch. I sat there on the porch until the sun dipped low and the air turned cold. The cubs barely moved. Every few minutes the smallest one let out a weak, rasping cry, as if it didn't even have the strength to be afraid anymore. I went inside and searched the cabinets. I found a small bottle of honey I kept for tea, some stale crackers, rice, and a can of tuna. I didn't know if tuna was safe for lynx cubs, but I had no choice. I opened the can and scooped a little onto a spoon. I stepped outside again and knelt down. The largest cub sniffed the tuna and tried to lick it, but its tongue barely moved. The middle one didn't react at all. The smallest just lay there, its eyes half closed. My chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on it from the inside. I had to help them. I didn't care how dangerous it was. They were babies. Helpless babies. I took my phone and called animal control again. Still no answer. I left another message, this time more desperate. "Please, please, they're starving. 3 lynx cubs. They're dying on my porch. I don't know what to do. I ended the call and sat there, staring at the cubs. I thought about when I was 10 years old, living with my mom in her small apartment over the diner. She brought home a box of half-dead kittens someone had left in a dumpster behind the store. We spent the whole night feeding them with an eyedropper. I remembered how small their bodies felt in my hands, how they trembled, how their eyes couldn't stay open for more than a second. I remembered thinking, back then, that saving something so tiny felt like saving the whole world. I shook the thought away and looked back at the cubs. They weren't kittens. They were wild animals. But at that moment, they looked so small and broken, I couldn't see the difference. I went inside again and grabbed a towel from the bathroom. I came back and knelt down, gently lifting the smallest cub first. Its body was so light it felt like lifting a bundle of dry grass. I wrapped it in the towel and held it against my chest. It didn't even try to struggle. The middle one watched me with glazed eyes. I reached out with my free hand and stroked its head. Its fur was coarse and dirty, but it leaned into my touch for a second before its head dropped again. I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned my head quickly and saw my neighbor, Mark, standing at the edge of my driveway with his arms crossed over his chest. He wore his usual dirty baseball cap and flannel shirt. His dog, a big German shepherd named Rex, stood beside him, tail stiff, ears perked forward. Mark called out without stepping closer. "What the hell are you doing, Dan?" I shifted the cub in my arms and stood up slowly. "They're lynx cubs, Mark. Someone left them here while I was gone." He squinted at me, then at the porch. "Those things are dangerous. You need to call someone." "I already did. No one's answering." Mark snorted and shook his head. "Should have just left them. Nature sorts itself out." I felt anger spark in my chest, hot and sharp. "They're just babies, Mark." He shrugged. "Babies grow up. And when they do, they'll rip your face off. Come on, Rex." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel. Rex gave me one last look, ears still forward, then trotted after him. I watched them go, my heart pounding with anger and something like fear. I looked down at the cub in my arms. Its eyes were closed, its breathing shallow. I went back inside, laid the cub gently on a folded blanket by the fireplace, and went out to get the other two. One by one, I carried them inside. They were so light it felt wrong, like I was holding shadows instead of living creatures. I sat down on the floor beside them, listening to their weak breathing. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of Mark's truck starting up next door. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't even know if they would survive the night. But as I sat there with 3 tiny wild lives depending on me, I felt something shift deep inside my chest, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to fight for something again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the old couch, staring at the 3 cubs curled up together on the folded blanket by the fireplace. I kept listening for their breathing, afraid it would stop at any moment. The smallest cub's chest moved so faintly I had to lean close to see it. I put my hand near its nose. The breath was there, but so thin it felt like a candle flickering in a storm. Morning light came slowly, gray and cold. I got up stiffly and went to the kitchen to make coffee. My hands were shaking when I poured it. I hadn't felt fear like this in years, fear of losing something helpless. I tried calling animal control again. Voicemail. I left another message, voice raw with exhaustion. "Please, they're still alive. Please call me back." I hung up and went back to the cubs. I knelt down and touched each of them gently, checking if they were warm. The middle one lifted its head a little and let out a hoarse sound, something between a mewl and a cough. The biggest one was awake, staring at me with dull, yellow eyes. Then I saw it. On the biggest cub's front paw, just above the joint, was a thin red mark. I leaned closer and squinted. It wasn't just a scrape. There were small indentations around it, like something had dug into its skin. I swallowed hard and reached out, gently turning the paw over. My fingers brushed against a rough patch. A tiny piece of frayed green rope was still tangled around the fur, almost hidden by the dirt and matted hair. My heart started pounding. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen drawer and came back. I cut the rope off carefully and held it up in the morning light. It was thin, synthetic, the kind used for tying up trash bags or old tarps. Someone had tied this cub up. I sat back on my heels, staring at the rope in my hand. The cub pulled its paw back against its chest and licked it weakly. My mind felt like it was spinning. Who would tie up a lynx cub? And why leave it here? I was so focused on the rope, I didn't hear the truck pull into my driveway. The engine shut off, the door slammed. Heavy boots crunched on gravel. Dan, you home? It was Mark. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, trying to calm the anger already burning in my chest. I'm here, Mark. He stepped into the doorway without knocking. His eyes flicked from me to the cubs by the fireplace. His lips curled in disgust. You still got those damn things in here? I stood up, the rope still clenched in my fist. Yeah, I do. He shook his head and snorted. You're insane. They're wild animals. They'll die anyway, or they'll grow up and rip your throat out while you sleep. I stepped closer to him, feeling the heat rising in my face. They're babies, Mark. They didn't choose to be here. He narrowed his eyes at me. You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Saving the little forest monsters. Well, let me tell you something. You keep them here, and when the mother comes looking, you'll be sorry. I stared at him, my chest heaving. He didn't know. He didn't see what I saw. I held up the piece of rope. Someone tied this one up. Someone left them here to die. For the first time, Mark's expression changed. His brow furrowed, his mouth opened slightly. Tied up? What the hell are you talking about? I shook my head. Go home, Mark. He stood there for a moment longer, then spat on the floor just inside the doorway. Don't come crying to me when they tear your place apart. He turned and left, slamming the screen door so hard it rattled in the frame. I watched him cross the yard to his truck, Rex trotting beside him with his ears back. When they were gone, I knelt down by the cubs again. The smallest one wasn't moving much. I picked it up gently, feeling its bones under my fingers, and held it against my chest. I could feel its heartbeat, faint and fluttering. I didn't know how much time we had left, but I knew one thing for sure. Someone did this to them, and I was going to find out who. The next morning came with a dull, heavy sky. I didn't sleep again. Every hour I checked on the cubs, making sure they were still breathing. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep them here. They needed their mother, not me. I went out to the shed and grabbed an old canvas backpack. I laid a folded towel inside, then carried each cub out one by one, placing them gently into the bag. The smallest whimpered weakly but didn't struggle. When I lifted the bag onto my back, I felt how little they weighed. It felt wrong, like carrying empty shells. I locked the house and started walking down the dirt road that led into the forest behind my property. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and pine sap. Birds called from the trees, but their songs sounded distant, muffled by my worry. I walked for almost an hour, deeper into the forest than I'd gone in years. Branches scraped my arms, and burrs caught on my jeans. The path narrowed until it disappeared completely under thick ferns and moss. Finally, I reached a small clearing. Sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting the clearing with a soft silver glow. I knelt down and set the bag on the ground. I opened it carefully. The biggest cub lifted its head and blinked at the light. The other two stayed curled up, their breathing shallow and silent. Hey, little ones. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and looked around. The trees were quiet. I saw no movement. I listened, hoping to hear a rustle in the undergrowth, a low growl, any sign that their mother was near. Nothing. I sat there for a while, feeling the damp earth soak into the knees of my jeans. The cubs didn't move. The smallest one's eyes were closed, and its tiny body trembled with each breath. I looked up at the tall pines surrounding the clearing and felt an ache deep in my chest. I didn't know what else to do. They wouldn't survive with me. And maybe their mother was out here, searching for them. I heard a sound then, a soft snap of a twig behind me. I turned my head slowly. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a lynx. Full grown, massive. Her fur was thick and golden gray, tufted ears flicking forward as she stared at me. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Her eyes were locked on mine, wide and yellow, glowing in the dim light under the pines. She didn't move. Her body was low to the ground, muscles tense, but she didn't take a step forward. I stayed perfectly still, my hands frozen on the open backpack. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears. Then, slowly, she shifted her gaze to the cubs. Her ears twitched. I saw her nostrils flare as she sniffed the air, catching their scent. I wanted to speak, to tell her I wasn't going to hurt them, that I only wanted them to live. But the words stuck in my throat. She took one step forward, then another. Her paws moved silently over the moss. When she reached the edge of the clearing, She stopped again and lifted her head, sniffing the air. The biggest cub let out a small, hoarse cry. The lynx's ears flicked back, then forward again. Her eyes softened, just slightly. She stepped forward until she was only a few feet away. She lowered her head and sniffed the cubs. The biggest one reached its paw towards her muzzle, a tiny, weak movement. I felt tears burn in my eyes. My chest hurt so badly it was hard to breathe. She didn't look at me again. She gently nudged the biggest cub with her nose. It tried to stand, but stumbled sideways. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile trust held her there. For a long time, she stayed by the cubs, sniffing them, licking their faces. Then she lifted her head and looked into the forest. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. When I looked back, her eyes met mine one last time. There was no anger there, no fear, only something deep and unreadable, something that made my chest ache even more. She turned away and melted back into the shadows of the trees, silent as falling snow. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the place where she had been, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they had a chance now. Maybe I did too. I sat in that clearing for what felt like forever. The forest was silent again, except for the faint rustle of the lynx as she moved around her cubs. She sniffed each one, gently nudging them with her nose. The biggest cub tried to stand and pressed its tiny head against her chest, letting out a hoarse little cry. The other two barely moved, but their ears twitched at her scent. She began licking their fur, rough tongue working through the dirt and dust. She paused to look around the clearing, scanning the trees and shadows, then returned to grooming her babies. I could see her muscles tense under her thick fur, ready to spring away if I moved even an inch. I didn't dare. I sat as still as I could, barely breathing. My heart was hammering so loud I was afraid she'd hear it and bolt. After a long while, she lowered her head and gently picked up the smallest cub by the scruff of its neck. The cub let out a weak sound as she lifted it, but then it went silent, hanging limp in her jaws. She turned and slipped into the trees, vanishing so quickly it was like she had melted into the forest floor itself. I waited, staring at the spot where she disappeared, the blood roaring in my ears. Minutes passed, and then she returned. She walked back into the clearing, her yellow eyes flicking to me for only a second before she bent down to the second cub. She repeated the same silent ritual, picking up the second cub and carrying it into the woods. The biggest cub tried to follow her, stumbling on trembling legs, but it collapsed halfway across the clearing and lay there, panting hard. She came back for it last. Her movements were so fluid, so silent, it made the hair on my arms stand up. She sniffed her last baby, licked its ears, then picked it up in her jaws. Before she left, she paused and turned to look at me. For a moment, our eyes locked again. In that moment, something passed between us, something deep and ancient that I couldn't put into words. A silent understanding. She blinked once, slowly, then turned and vanished into the shadows with her last cub dangling from her mouth. The clearing felt empty after she left. I sat there until my legs went numb, staring at the moss where the cubs had been. My chest felt hollow, like something had been scooped out of me and carried away. Eventually, I stood up. My knees popped painfully. I picked up the empty backpack and slung it over my shoulder. As I walked back through the forest, pushing through the ferns and brambles, everything felt quieter than before. Even the birds seemed silent, as if the whole world was holding its breath. By the time I reached my house, the sun was high and hot. I dropped the backpack by the door and went inside. The house felt empty, too quiet without the faint sounds of the cubs breathing. I walked from room to room, not really seeing anything. My hands shook as I poured a glass of water, but I didn't drink it. I just stood there, staring out the window at the forest beyond. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the lonely sound of the wind moving through the trees. I kept seeing her eyes, that deep golden gaze, looking straight into me. I didn't know what she saw there. I didn't know if she understood what I had done, or if she even cared. All I knew was that I felt different, emptier, and yet somehow lighter, too. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, I got up and went to the front door. I opened it, expecting nothing but the quiet gray of morning. But there, on the porch, was a gift. A small, freshly killed rabbit lay on the wooden boards, its fur still damp with dew. Its neck was broken cleanly. No blood, just a perfect, silent offering. I stood there, staring at it, feeling my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. Gratitude, sorrow, fear, wonder, all of it mixed together until I couldn't tell one feeling from the next. I bent down and picked up the rabbit. Its body was still warm. I looked out at the forest, the shadows between the trees still deep and dark. Somewhere out there, she was watching. I didn't know if it was a thank you or a warning. I didn't know who had tied up those cubs, or why they had chosen my porch to leave them on. But I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in my life would ever be the same again. I stepped back inside and closed the door, feeling the weight of her gaze still on me, even though I couldn't see her. And for the first time in years, I whispered a quiet prayer, hoping she understood it somehow, out there in the silent, watching woods.